This is 15 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by the Natural Gas Supply Association. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on the challenges of permitting, we're going to talk with Gretchen Kershaw, Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Strategy for Power Sector Consultant Grid Strategies. Gretchen's going to review efforts under the last administration to streamline permitting urgently needed transmission and describe efforts that could succeed under the current leadership. Gretchen joined Grid Strategies in February of this year after serving as Senior Advisor on Transmission in the Biden Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office. Before that, Gretchen was the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission legal advisor to Chair Richard Glick and then managing attorney and senior legal advisor to the Commission's General Counsel. Gretchen, how significantly is development of new transmission impeded under current practices, and what are the obstacles?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me today and for that introduction. I never pass up an opportunity to nerd out on transmission, which is my beloved topic of choice. On the sort of impeded transmission, one of the biggest obstacles facing the development of new transmission is just the system itself. We have a very fragmented system. It's not designed to build large regional networks. It started with individual utilities focused on operating within their own local monopoly service territory, and we have largely not broken free of that paradigm. And so with that backdrop of how we got to where we are today, it's not surprising that very little long distance transmission has been built. Historically, looking back as a country, we did pretty well in 2013. We built around 4,000 miles of high voltage transmission.
That was a decade ago.
Yep, that's right. So we're talking about that 345 kV or higher transmission. That number was at 4,000 in 2013. It dropped down to less than 2,000 a year in 2014 and 2015, then down to consistently under 1,000 from 2016 to 2020, then consistently less than 500 per year from 2021 to 2023. And we did see this number increase in 2024 to around 800 miles, but still not a lot of high voltage transmission is being built. And the reason this matters is that while we've seen this drop in development of high voltage transmission, at the same time, we have seen an increase in the need for transmission. This is driven primarily by, first of all, reliability and resilience needs, right? We have an aging system, we have increasingly frequent severe weather events. Second is demand growth. That's all everybody can talk about these days, predominantly due to the exponential increase in AI data centers. And then the third driver is this sort of increasingly pressing affordability issue that we're seeing. So taking that, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's interesting because the transmission can be a solution that can make energy more affordable, can deliver more energy, and can allow energy to be delivered from different directions during severe weather events. So all those things that require the needs for it make it very necessary, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, people can't see me nodding, but I am nodding along. Absolutely, transmission is a piece of the puzzle to affordability, even if it's sometimes a complicated story to tell. So just sort of getting down to your topic, right? The question for today, why are we not building more of it, right? We know we need more. We're not building very much. There are what people call the 3 Ps, which is planning, paying, and permitting. Those are 3 of the biggest barriers. There are also other barriers to building any linear infrastructure like transmission. Today, we're facing significant supply chain constraints, workforce limitations, local opposition, regulatory uncertainty. But just drilling down on permitting, I think that there's some really impressive numbers here. It regularly takes over a decade to develop a large-scale transmission project. For some, takes more like 15 years or more. Much of that time is spent in the permitting process. And this is because most large-scale transmission requires federal, state, and local permits. And what I find to be particularly shocking is sometimes county by county permits are even required, which can be incredibly time-consuming for transmission developers. And the average time at the federal level for completing a NEPA review document, an environmental impact statement, is 4 years. It's usually longer than that for large scale transmission. And then sort of layering on, completing a NEPA document is not necessarily authorization to begin construction. Sometimes there are several more years before you get that construction authorization from the federal government. So I wanted to give just a couple of concrete examples so everybody knows I'm not just making this up. As I mentioned, in 2024, we saw around 800 new miles of high voltage transmission built. Pretty significant increase from the past couple of years. But to put it into perspective, 125 of those 800 miles were from the 10 West Link project that CAISO first approved for including in its transmission planning process in 2013. So over a decade before it went into service. Another 100+ miles of that came from Cardinal Hickory Creek project, which MISO included in its multi-value project portfolio in 2011, so over a decade ago. A third project that came online in 2024 in that 800-mile bucket is the Energy Gateway South line, originally announced by the developer in 2007. It was partially completed in 2015. The last segment finally completed 17 years after that development was first announced. This is not uncommon, right? These are all ones coming on in 2024. SunZia is under construction now after 17 years of development. Boardman to Hemingway project has been in permitting for going on 2 decades now. So sort of long story short, all of that is we need a lot of transmission. It takes a long time to development. And one of the biggest problems and barriers is permitting timelines.
A lot of those project names are not going to be familiar to some of our listeners, but there were major projects 15 years ago, and sometimes more. By the way, I just found out yesterday, we're going to have someone representing SunZia on the podcast soon to talk about what they went through to finally get their project in development. Let's move to something else about this, Gretchen. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, I think it was last year, after a long period of time working on it, passed Order 1920 and then some revisions. It was really a landmark in transmission planning. And it has things in it about permitting, but permitting, it still is what it is. Do you think 1920 is going to have an impact on getting transmission built?
Yeah, that's a great question. You said it was under development for a long time. I worked on the advanced notice proposed rulemaking and the NOPR for 1920, even before I went to GDO and before I came here. And I do think that how FERC's transmission planning rules fit into sort of the transmission development, what I like to call the life cycle of a transmission project, sometimes gets lost. Right, there is just a tremendous amount of moving parts and regulatory bodies and stakeholders and barriers. And planning is really important. It's a really important piece of that life cycle, but it is just one of the pieces of that full development cycle. One thing to note is that different transmission planners consider siting and permitting barriers to different degrees in different areas of the country, which I think is very interesting. It's driven in part by the way transmission is planned and by whom. And so you have your vertically integrated utilities, they're planning generation, transmission, distribution. They're definitely thinking about siting and permitting because they're going to take on that process themselves. Then you have some regional planners that sort of disavow any role in siting and permitting. It's not part of their process. They do the planning, they select where it's needed and where the project goes at a electrical scale, but not at a siting and permitting land-based scale. But the reality is it doesn't matter how it's planned. Siting and permitting is critical. It's going to be a challenge, especially if it's a new build. And so looking at Order 1920, I think one of the most important pieces there for transmission development is that forward-looking long-term outlook. So transmission planning has been historically very near-term focused, looking out 5 years, maybe 10 years. Now Order 1920 requires developers to look out 20 years. And so I wanted to give those examples earlier to sort of hit home the point. We're talking about these really long development timelines. And so having that certainty that a project is needed allows developers to enter the permitting process sooner. It also allows them to convince regulators who need to issue the permits sooner that the transmission project is indeed needed. Another thing that sort of historically transmission planning has failed to do is consider all the drivers of transmission. They've been looking at buckets of transmission needs and silos, just reliability, just economics, just public policies. And this has a lot of negative results. And the reason I bring it up related to permitting is because it's a lot harder to justify a project to regulators if you are ignoring significant benefits of the project. And so Order 1920 requires a more fulsome consideration of the drivers of the transmission and also the different benefits of the solutions, which may still to be seen, but may translate into better and more successful permitting. Historically, there is some trends in projects planned through regional planning processes having more successful permitting coming out of that than those planned outside of the processes. And sort of the last, oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead. You were going to say one more thing, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say one more thing about 1920 that I think sort of ties into permitting, and that's just the role of states. And it pulls states into the mix more than ever before, and it gives them a really defined role in transmission planning and cost allocation. And so I think that states are more likely to support transmission when they are part of that process, and they're part of understanding the need, the drivers, the alternatives, and the benefits. And so that's sort of another sort of linchpin and potential for 1920 to facilitate siting and permitting of these projects.
A lot of the obstacles that are embedded in 1920 tries to address, even though they're embedded in the process, go back to what you said earlier about how our system is balkanized. It's controlled by local utilities. You talked about the three P's: paying, permitting, and planning. 1920 addresses planning, and it gets at paying. For a long time, if a utility had its own transmission, it didn't want to participate in larger transmission systems, or it had reluctance about permitting because there was a lot of incentive for it not to have that. By bringing the states in, as you described, and by bringing a understanding of the greater types of benefits that can come from transmission, it allows people to sort of say, wait a minute, you might have an incentive for not having new transmission here because you get to benefit from it, but a lot of other people will benefit if there is new transmission. Am I saying that right, Gretchen? I want to make sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that the idea is if you fully consider the benefits and you give the ability to allocate the cost of those transmission projects across a wider area, it not only defrays the cost for individual ratepayers, but it also ensures that the beneficiaries of the line truly are paying for it. And that's sort of why these regional networks were formed, not only to share in the power resources, but also to gain the efficiencies, economies of scale, and all of the reliability and resilience benefits, especially that come from that larger network.
This episode is brought to you by the Natural Gas Supply Association, a DC-based trade association that represents domestic producers and marketers of natural gas. Natural gas stands out as a fuel of choice for America's energy future. It is affordable, reliable, and sustainable. Today, natural gas powers a growing share of industrial facilities, data centers, homes, and also supports the expansion of renewable energy. The benefits of natural gas rely not only on expanding our nation's energy infrastructure, like pipelines and storage facilities, but also ensuring regulatory certainty so businesses can construct and maintain this infrastructure. The Natural Gas Supply Association advocates for permitting reform to streamline the process for approving necessary infrastructure projects without compromising environmental protections. The natural gas sector has proven itself adaptable and resilient, meeting rising demand while maintaining affordability. By investing in infrastructure, embracing permitting reform, and fostering a fact-based regulatory environment, we can ensure that natural gas continues to be a reliable foundation for America's energy future. It is our responsibility to strengthen this foundation today so that we can meet the energy demands of tomorrow. Learn more by visiting www.ngsa.org.
Yeah. Okay, we've talked about your time at FERC now. Let's talk about your time at DOE. You were in the Grid Deployment Office, and you worked on some really interesting programs. You worked on something called the Coordinated Interagency Transmission Authorizations and Permits Program. DOE has some really good titles, and you led the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors Program. And that one's really interesting because it gives DOE authority to trigger a special authority that FERC has to get transmission built. But I don't want to explain those things. You explain them, Gretchen, and more importantly, these were really good ideas. What's happening with them now?
Yeah, so let's start with the mouthful, the Coordinated Interagency Transmission Authorizations and Permits, or CITAP program. So CITAP is aimed at really better coordinating federal permitting. So what I like to call getting the federal house in order, right? There's state and local permitting, but let's get the federal house in order first. And this is using authority in the Federal Power Act, Section 216H, which was added to the statute in 2005. So it's not new authority. Under CITAP, DOE is a lead agency. DOE coordinates all the federal reviews and authorizations required for transmission projects that qualify to apply to this program. And this standing up is followed from an MOU where 9 federal agencies came together, which is, of course, an act of God in and of itself to get 9 federal agencies to sign an MOU. So they came together. And then Congress made some changes to NEPA in the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. So there are a couple different things that we were implementing in this rulemaking. And so some key elements here are, first, I mentioned DOE acts as the lead agency. And what's key here is that DOE is coordinating all of these different authorizations that come from different agencies with the developer, which just makes the federal permitting process more efficient. And then DOE is leading in a pre-application process. It's a real cornerstone of what FERC does with natural gas pipelines, and DOE is now doing through the CITAP program, making sure that you're collecting the needed information, sharing it among the agencies, and getting everything lined up so that you can review it on a binding 2-year timeline, which is a really important piece of this. Another key element that I think is just incredible about it is that DOE prepares a single NEPA document, which reduces significant duplication of work. And so in the past, the status quo was each agency was preparing its own NEPA document. So this is just an incredible leveraging of resources into one single document. And then another thing that I think is interesting, could be really valuable if the states opt in, is that state siting authorities can actually participate in CITAP along with the federal agencies. They can leverage what DOE is offering, including that single environmental review document. And so the North Plains Connector project is currently using CITAP for its permitting, and the Montana Department of Environmental Quality is collaborating in this joint preparation of environmental impact statement to meet both the federal and state requirements. And so we'll see how that sort of pilot follows through, but could be really incredible. And the program design is meant to cut the average time. I mentioned it takes 4 years to do an EIS. This is supposed to cut it in half to 2 years. How it's, yeah, I was just gonna say how it's going. I think that there's a lot of support for the program, even in the new administration. But when I left GDO, I think we had something like 10 to 15 full-time staff on this program. I think that number is now down to maybe 2. So it's hard to say what the future is, even though it is a really incredible program.
Before we move to the program that you led, the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors program, I want to just mention, we've mentioned NIPA a few times, National Environmental Policy Act. It was a really landmark protection for the environment when it was passed. Lawmakers thought maybe there'd be a paper, a study that maybe would last a year or so, 2 years, and maybe be 150 pages. But now we're having, for these transmission projects, volumes in the NEPA studies. That's one of the slowdowns. The other thing I wanted to mention before we move on to this next program is that what this complicated acronym, CITAP, C-I-T-A-P, Coordinated Interagency Transmission Authorizations and Permits. The key there is coordinated interagency. I've seen graphics. There may be 9 or more agencies that have to pass to get a transmission project approved. I believe that's accurate, isn't it, Gretchen?
Yep, there are 9 agencies, and not every transmission project will trigger a permit from all 9, but they each have their own separate authority over projects.
So what DOE was trying to do here, and it's no small task, is somehow coordinate and shorten and get everybody to agree to work together in the same direction. It will be really exciting to see if this pilot that you mentioned turns out well. Tell us now about the program you led, National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors.
Yes, so those are NIETC or NITC as we pronounce it. One of the reasons I joined GDO, left FERC back in 2023 was to help dust off this authority, start from the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to try to make what I like to call make lemonades from lemons. It was a one-time DOE attempted to use it and it did not work out. So trying to really leverage it to facilitate transmission development. So how it works is Federal Power Act 216A. Now we were in 216H for SITEP. Now we're in 216A. DOE has to prepare a state of the grid report every 3 years, this longstanding requirement. In 2023, the latest version came out called the National Transmission Needs Study. And DOE looks at this study, looks at other information coming out of RTOs and ISOs and other studies to identify areas of the country where the lack of adequate transmission harms consumers. And these areas of the country are what are called NITCs. And DOE designating an area as a NITC has a couple of impacts, obviously focusing attention on key areas of need at anything coming out of the federal government like this. It also unlocks federal financial tools, which was something new as of 2021. And that includes public-private partnerships under the Transmission Facilitation Program and direct loans under the Transmission Facility Financing Program, which is one of the programs that has been on the congressional chopping block. So unclear how that will go. Third most relevant here, NITC designation triggers FERC's limited federal backstop siting authority for transmission projects in NITCs. And so when I was in GDO, we created a new 4-phase process to designate NITCs. We started it in December 2023. As of December 2024, we had made it to phase 3 and the administration changed. They came in, they actually extended the comment period on the phase 3 notice to April of this year. But now, since then, the NITCs are sitting, full expectation that they will be canceled once leadership signs off on one of the many memos sitting on their desks. On the FERC side, FERC did issue a final rule to implement its backstop siting authority. The reality, sort of my opinion, is that it's highly unlikely any project will qualify to apply for a permit because there has to be a NITC. And honestly, I don't think it will ever work out. And so sort of looking at SITEP, looking at NITC, shaping my view on permitting reform. We can talk about this more, but it's definitely led to sort of a more nuanced view, if you will, on federal primary siting authority as well as NEPA reform, and sort of is there a role for corridor designation like envisioned by the Federal Power Act tied to that federal siting or not?
Well, what strikes me about both these programs is it captures the challenge in permitting, which is that you have different groups that both or many claim that they represent the public interest. And somebody has to sort of figure out how to coordinate and streamline, if you will, the process of figuring out where the public interest actually lies. We had under Biden an administration that was trying to work toward streamlining the process in a reasoned, step-by-step way. Our new administration, for the most part, likes the chainsaw approach. It's going to be interesting to see how the outcome of all that is. But I want to really quickly get to one more topic before we close this out, Gretchen. There are a lot of proposals about legislation to reform the permitting process. We've been looking at this for a while now. Last year, there was a near miss. A lot of people seem to like the Manchin-Barrasso bill, and I've talked to a lot of people who are still talking about sort of bringing that back, at least as a template. Do you think these things like the programs you just described are key elements in what needs to be reformed? Are there other elements that you want to talk about? And what are the politics of legislating these elements?
Yes, so that's the $1 billion question. How can we reform permitting? Anytime you talk about people's land, it's going to be a hard sell and it's going to be complicated. So that's the baseline of the politics. But I think sort of my first wish list item really is that there be federal primary siting authority over interstate high voltage transmission lines. The federal government already issues permits for other energy infrastructure. This is not a new thing. FERC does this for gas pipelines. The federal government already permits LNG terminals. The federal government permits transmission on federal lands. We just talked about SIDAP. The federal government permits cross-border transmission. And so I think the reality is that we have tried the current approach. As I explained earlier, it is not working. It's not any state's fault. It's not the federal government's fault. It's not a landowner or advocacy group's fault. It's just that we have what is an interstate problem, right? We need to build interstate transmission, and that is the federal government's role, to step in to have an interstate solution. I don't think that it has to be all transmission lines. I don't think it even has to be all interstate transmission lines, but I think it has to be the big critical transmission projects that we cannot afford to continue lagging behind. So I think we have to clearly define which transmission projects they are, and we need a clear standard for the federal permitting agency to issue the permit for those lines. So that's sort of my top bucket list item. Whether I'm going to get it, I don't know. But sort of, moving down the list, I think not everyone, but many people are in agreement that we need some guardrails on the scope of NEPA review. I mean, you talked about it, you gave a great intro there. I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do think environmental review is a critical part of siting and permitting, especially the transparency, public awareness, participation opportunities that are embedded in NEPA. But I do think that there is plenty of room for improvement. And, the Supreme Court issued a decision on NEPA review. I think that Chair Westerman has a bill that codifies that. I think that's probably something that we'll see. I think that there's also a need to define sort of what alternatives you consider under NEPA to the proposed project, so that those alternatives are not alternatives that a transmission developer would never actually pursue and are just drumming up opposition. And then the third one that gets a little bit spicier is, I think we need some constraints on judicial review of permitting decisions. And I come at this from 14 years in the federal government as a lawyer. The fear of litigation is truly paralyzing. It is apparent in NEPA reviews. So many hours spent debating what to call documents so that you don't get sued because, oh, this was actually a notice when it was supposed to be this. Layer and review chains, trying to hedge against typos, and whether you're exercising your discretion in a way that completely insulates it from litigation. And I think that is not what is going to move transmission forward ever. And I don't think it's really the purpose and greatest benefit from NEPA. And so I think that some clear requirements around judicial review would be really valuable and would give certainty, honestly, to both the advocates who are doing a really important job holding permitting agencies accountable, as well as allowing needed infrastructure to move forward. And then I have to say one thing before we run out of time, which is just that we need regulatory certainty. We can't have administrations change every 4 years and rewrite the entire playbook on what we're doing here. It's just increasing litigation risk, it's increasing project timelines, and it's the opposite of what we need moving forward.
Those are things that there is a wide range of agreement on, and there's going to be a real focus on permitting reforms on Capitol Hill when this Congress comes back from this summer break. So I think all eyes will be on it, and I know you're going to be busy talking to people. I got to thank my guest, Grid Strategy's Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Strategy, Gretchen Kershaw. She's provided a terrific overview of the need to streamline permitting for urgently needed transmission and the legislative and regulatory efforts now in play to do that. I also want to thank our sponsor, the Natural Gas Supply Association. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.